to introduce our second panel of the day with a focus on metaphysics. Our moderator is Karina Vold, who's an assistant professor at the Institute for the History and Philosophy of Science and Technology here at the University of Toronto. Excuse me. Her current projects include researching the effects of AI on human cognition and autonomy, understanding the harms arising from targeted online nudging, evaluating arguments for existential threats from AI, and building frameworks for the ethical design of AI systems. I'll now pass it over to Karina to introduce our panelists.
Thank you so much, Kelly, and thanks everyone for joining today. Panelists, I hope that you all can see me and hear me. I'll introduce you in more detail, maybe as we turn to you. But just as a quick round of introduction, we're joined by Professor Joseph Rouse, who's a professor of philosophy at Wesleyan University. We're also joined by Professor Joel Walmsley, who's senior lecturer in philosophy at the University of College Cork. And finally, we're also joined by Professor Güven Güzeldere. I hope I said that right.
Good enough. Yeah, thank you.
Oh, perfect. Who's an AI and consciousness researcher. And so we'll hear a quick chat from each of our panelists, and then that will be followed by a discussion, hopefully with questions from all of you, as well as a few from myself. Before I pass over, we'll go into that order just so the panelists have a heads up. So I'll turn to Joseph next. I'll just say one quick sort of emotion or feeling I have about Brian, I guess. I'm sure everyone's had a chance to share wonderful stories about him. I met Brian probably first at the University of Cambridge when he came to give a keynote lecture at a conference I was organizing. And what I was struck most by Brian was how much he saw and spent time with students, people who hadn't yet made a name at all in the field, and how sort of welcoming he was to all of us. And I especially feel that, big people, and Brian was a big person, make you feel big, and Brian made me feel big. And as a great person, I think Brian saw greatness in everything, and he had this kind of curiosity about everything he looked at. And I thought that was just like the memory, the way I think of Brian is with that lens of like lifting people up and really making them feel as special as he was. And I appreciated that a lot about him, and also saw him do that with so many others. With that, I want to pass to our panelists. So Joseph, I'll pass to you first.
I'd like to thank the organizers for extending me the invitation. It's a great honor for me to be able to speak in honor of my friend and colleague, Brian Cantwell Smith, from whom I learned so much. I will take up four aspects of, well, wait a second, my slides are not going forward now. There we go. I will take up four aspects of Brian's views about the metaphysics of intentionality: his core conception of intentionality, his account of the demarcation of objects, his conception of the world as that which is registered conceptually, and his insistence on the world's non-conceptual character. I endorse the first three claims, but from a somewhat different orientation than Brian's own. I then reject his account of the world as non-conceptual, but I do so by drawing on one of Brian's key premises and several of his own insights. Brian's account of intentional directedness figures centrally in his forthcoming book, criticizing key issues in theoretical computer science. It has three key normative components. First, an intentionally directed system must be causally effective in its own operations, in the sense in which we talk about effective computability. Second, its directedness toward a target must be subject to assessment according to criteria stemming from the target. And third, intentional directedness and its normative accountability must extend beyond its causally effective reach. I endorse this conception while extending it in two important respects. Brian criticizes mainstream theoretical computer science for neglect of the second component. He argues that theorists have reduced the semantic normativity of a computational system to its effective normativity, and thus, quote, no longer take one outside the boundaries of a mechanical device. I think he has understated the difficulty. The norms of effective operation already take one outside the boundaries of a mind or a mechanistic device to the external causal capacities relevant to its operation and its shielding from them. A computational device would be ineffective in temperatures that melt its components, pressures that crush them, magnetic fields affecting its electrical circuits, or disconnection of its power source. Recognition of the system's own participation in and vulnerability to the world is integral to the normativity of intentional directedness. My second extension of Brian's conception strengthens the relationship between the system's causally effective operation and its directedness beyond its causal reach. Brian rightly argues that intentional directedness is not a causally effective relationship and that it must extend beyond the system's causal engagement. One must nevertheless ask in which respects a system can direct itself beyond its local situation. Intentional directedness is always under an aspect. The conceptualization of those aspects depends on practical and perceptual access to domains of causal interaction within which the relevant concepts and can be interconnected practically and inferentially and connected to what they're about. The conceptual role of experimental and other material systems in scientific research exemplifies this point. We customarily think of scientific progress in terms of the growth of knowledge. A more fundamental role for scientific work, however, has been to open whole domains of inquiry to concrete conceptualization. We can now speak meaningfully and concretely about such things as electromagnetism, cellular structure and function, deep time, atomic structure, and many other scientific domains. That ability was made possible by the experimental and technological activities that allow their conceptual articulation and inferential interrelation. By introducing new phenomena with salient patterns and boundaries that can then be modeled conceptually, the sciences articulate the world into determinate objects, properties, and relations. The same is true of our everyday causal interactions with the world around us. Thus, the systems whose causally effective operation enables conceptually articulated and intentional directedness do not stop at body surfaces or a machine's data input ports. Intentional systems must instead extend beyond out into practical engagement with the world and perceptual trackings of its outcomes. The second point I want to address is Brian's denial that the world comes chopped up into neat, ontologically discrete mesoscale objects. Taking the world to consist of discrete, intelligible objects is an achievement of intelligence, not a premise for it. Object boundaries are instituted by conceptual systems and practices. Brian appeals to many considerations to support this claim. He was fond of cartographic examples. The number and bounds of islands, mountains, or rivers is not fixed by nature. He also appeals to scientific examples, from the physics of fields to the inability to track cellular identity across mitotic divisions. Brian took many sciences to deal in particularity rather than individuality. And On the Origin of Objects, he highlighted pervasive ambiguities of reference in computational systems. I think Brian is right about these examples, but he may have been hesitant to invoke what I take to be the most compelling considerations in favor of his view. The world's multifaceted causal entanglements provide the most pervasive reasons for denying intrinsic boundaries to objects within the world. Efforts to articulate determinate relations of causes to effects require setting boundary conditions, backgrounding other causally efficacious circumstances, and conceptualizing the respects in which these causal relations can be isolated. The resulting boundaries to objects with causal powers and describable properties are nevertheless not arbitrary. Drawing them one way rather than another has publicly accessible consequences that are reproducible and communicable. They thereby mark real patterns in the world, but these patterns incorporate the relevant conceptual practices and norms. My third theme is Brian's talk about the world as that which intentional systems register conceptually and to which they must be deferential. His argument encompasses a recognition that intentional directedness must always be intelligibly situated within the world. Both the intentional system itself and its aspectual orientation toward an object belong to and must answer to their place within more encompassing surroundings. That is in part why I argued previously that the supposedly internal causal effectiveness of a computational device or any other intentional system actually extends outward into engagement with causally relevant circumstances. It also explains why Brian implicitly denied that the world itself can be an object and should really only be indicated demonstratively. Objects are always in the world and must be understood as abstracted from and intelligible as belonging to a world that exceeds their bounds. To that extent, all conceptualization of objects must be idealizing. Brian and I understood this deferential belonging to the world in slightly different terms, however. For Brian, the world outran the boundaries of conceptually articulated intentional directedness because of the fine-grained qualitative richness we encounter within it. That inexhaustible richness of detail is manifest in perception and action, and also in the subterranean patterns discerned by machine learning systems. I don't disagree with these as descriptive claims. I nevertheless see them as consequences of the world's multifaceted causal entanglement. This small disagreement plays out in a larger disagreement about whether we should understand the world as non-conceptual, which is my fourth and final point. The locus of our disagreement concerns conceptual understanding itself. Brian argued that our conceptually structured engagements, quote, characterize the world in terms of a pre-established stock of objects, types, properties, and so on, in propositional structures, CAD systems, architectural blueprints, databases, and the like. And he then concluded that any directedness not shaped by conceptual repertoires would then have a non-conceptual content. Three of Brian's own insights best indicate what I think is mistaken about this claim. First, in his thinking about intentionality, computation, and conceptual systems, Brian rightly insisted on the explanatory priority of dynamical norms, norms governing activity or use, to what he called statical norms, norms governing states. Quoting him, semantic evaluation, content interpretation, etc., derive from large-scale dynamic activity. What matters is how a system acts or operates, what it does, with what outcomes. By this standard, however, Brian's treatment of conceptual systems in terms of a stock of expressions is surprisingly statical. Second, we need to extend Brian's dynamical understanding of computation to reconfigure what we understand as conceptual. He contrasted theoretical specifications of computational systems to what he called analysis of computation in the wild as an eruptive body of practices, techniques, machines, and behavior. I think we should similarly attend to conceptuality in the wild. Nancy Cartwright once remarked about physics that it is no theory that would require a new Hamiltonian for each new situation. Scientific practices instead work with a limited set of conceptual relationships and adapt them to myriad circumstances. Their modeling strategies allow increasingly fine-grained applications of their stock concepts. In other contexts, we use indexicals, demonstratives, other ostensive indications, and anaphora to bring the world's multiple causal entanglements and qualitative richness into the conceptual domain. Conceptual practices in the wild thus exemplify fine-grained practical and perceptual capacities rather than effacing them. Brian rightly criticized many philosophers and GOFI artificial intelligence systems for preemptively ontologizing the world based on conceptual repertoires. The problem, however, was not that they treated a non-conceptual world as if it were already conceptually articulated. They instead misconstrued conceptual practices themselves. They also failed thereby to grasp a third constitutive insight from Brian, that the world is not an intentional object. It therefore cannot rightly be construed as either conceptually or non-conceptually structured. The world is instead that wherein all intentional directedness and conceptual articulation are situated and normatively accountable. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Joseph. Next, I'll invite Joel Walmsley to speak. And as I mentioned, Joel's a senior lecturer in philosophy at the University of College in Cork, where he's been since 2006, and previously was a postdoctoral fellow here at the University of Toronto. Joel, go ahead.
Thanks. Excuse me. Well, thanks for inviting me, and thanks to everyone who's been involved with organizing today's event. Sorry, I'm getting a lot of echo. Here we go. There we go. So I know that the session today is billed as metaphysics, but I want to kind of be a bit mischievous and broaden the discussion, because I think at least my reading of what often gets understood as Brian's metaphysics is actually all of philosophy and metaphilosophy as well. So let me see if I can try and make good on that claim. I think it was the summer of 2004 when I was Brian's PhD student. He once said to me, well, you know, Joel, there are really only three questions in philosophy. What is there? How do you know? And why should you care? And he said this not in a seminar room or at a conference dinner or in a supervision meeting, but while we were unloading a U-Haul truck full of boxes of books. At the time, it somehow seemed like a perfectly reasonable place to be doing philosophy. And Brian's PhD supervisions were sometimes unconventional in one respect or another. And I suspect many of his former students here today might recognize that scene. At the time, I guess the remark sounded like a joke. It was delivered lightly and almost mischievously, but as I often found with Brian's remarks, it turned out to be a way of saying something quite serious while appearing not to. So what I want to suggest is that if we take that remark seriously, then although the book on the origin of objects, with which I've had the pleasure of reacquainting myself recently, although it sounds like it might be a work of metaphysics, it's not confined to that at all. It's also metaphilosophy. Some of the ideas in the book, like the middle distance and flex and slop, articulate a way of doing philosophy that kind of keeps all three questions in view at once. And it's that way of thinking, rather than any particular doctrine, that I want to focus on. So start with the first of Brian's three questions. What is there? That's where I think Brian's work most clearly resists a familiar picture of what metaphysics is supposed to do. Because on the one hand, there's a temptation to answer the question, what is there, by kind of driving all the way down to fundamental physics or to microstructure or to whatever is taken to be ontologically basic. On on the other hand, there's the opposite temptation to treat objects and meanings and structures as fully autonomous entities, insulated from the messy details of practice and interaction. But Brian's notion of the middle distance is kind of a refusal of both extremes. And it's the claim that the things we care about, objects, representations, norms, even computational systems, are real, but real at a certain scale or stance. They're not illusions, but they're not fundamental particles either. In a metaphor that I think Brian might have approved of, objects are like island coastlines. If you get too close and they dissolve into grains of sand, but if you get too far away, they become oversimplified outlines. It's only at the right distance that they become navigable, stable features. So it's that middle distance where objects show up as objects at all, where there's kind of enough stability to support reference and action, but enough openness for us to be, as he says, answerable to the world. And we want to avoid losing objects into fine-grained causal flux or into abstract formalism. And that's a lesson I think that also runs through Brian's work in computation and AI, where systems that are either too tightly coupled to signals or too detached into abstract symbol manipulation also fail to count as engaging with objects at all. For Brian's metaphysics, indeed for his philosophy, what matters is not drawing a clean boundary around what exists, but understanding how patterns of interaction stabilize into things that can be taken as real, but without pretending that that stabilization is either arbitrary or absolute. And that's why On the Origin of Objects isn't a catalogue of entities, but an account of how objecthood itself comes into being at the middle distance. It's also why Brian was suspicious of metaphysical views that promise either total reduction or total independence. Both in different ways lose the world. So Brian's answer to that first question, what is there? It's not a list, it's a location. The middle distance is where objects, meanings, and practices emerge together, and where metaphysics remains in contact with how things actually show up for us. But locating objects at the middle distance kind of immediately raises a further question. If what there is only shows up at a certain scale through ongoing interaction and practice and stabilization, then the world doesn't present us with sharply bounded entities waiting to be mirrored or represented exactly. And that's where Brian's ideas of flex and slop enter the picture. They're not epistemic afterthoughts or merely pragmatic concessions. They're metaphysical consequences of taking the middle distance seriously. So flex and slop might be read as features of our representations, as ways of coping with uncertainty or noise or limited information. But Brian's deeper claim, I think, is that they're features of the world as it shows up in the middle distance. Start with flex. For Brian, systems that engage with the world, biological or social or computational, have to be able to bend. They have to adjust to novelty, to variation, and to breakdown. Systems whose categories are fixed once and for all can't remain in contact with a changing world. They can only replay their own assumptions. And metaphysically, that means that the kinds of things that exist at the middle distance don't have perfectly sharp identity conditions. Objects persist through change, categories tolerate borderline cases, and norms admit of interpretation. But that's not a failure of precision, that's a condition of reality at that scale. Slop names the complementary idea, at least slop in Brian's sense, not the sense that we hear about discussed in AI these days. In Brian's sense, it's the idea that any representational scheme necessarily underdetermines the world. When we represent something perceptually or linguistically or computationally, the representation never fixes all the way the world might be or behave. There's always excess structure and ambiguity and openness left over, and that's why we encounter objects as resisting us or as capable of pushing back against our expectations. So that's why Brian was also suspicious of projects that aim for total exactness, both in metaphysics and in AI, and apparently including my own PhD project initially. A perfectly precise ontology or a perfectly formal representation wouldn't leave room for the kinds of entities that actually populate our world. Tools, texts, institutions, meanings, and of course objects themselves. So flex and slop aren't merely engineering tricks, but neither are they shortcomings. They're necessities for anything that exists at the middle distance. They describe what it is to be a thing that can persist, to be taken up, and to remain answerable in an open-ended world. And once we see that, the boundary between metaphysics and epistemology begins to blur. But that blurring's not a mistake or mere relativism. It's exactly what Brian thought a responsible metaphysics should look like. So if that's what there is, objects and meanings that exist at the middle distance with flex and slop built into their mode of being, then the question of knowledge looks very different from the way it's often framed. On this view, knowing's not a matter of constructing representations that mirror the world with increasing precision. It's a matter of remaining in contact with a world that's always capable of surprising us. Knowledge, on that view, is not a static achievement, but an ongoing skill or accomplishment. And that's why Brian was suspicious of epistemological ideals that treat certainty and completeness or exactness as the goal. Systems that demand those virtues, whether philosophical theories or computational architectures, end up protecting themselves from error at the cost of insulating themselves from the world. A knowing system has to be able to revise its categories and reinterpret its data and recover from failure. That requires room to move. Importantly, this doesn't, as I said, this doesn't collapse into relativism or skepticism. The world still pushes back. Objects resist us, practices break down and expectations fail, but they do so precisely because our grip on them isn't exact. So when Brian asks, how do you know? The answer is by staying engaged. Knowing is a matter of sustained responsiveness at the middle distance, where correction, learning, and responsibility are all still possible. And once knowledge is understood as a matter of ongoing engagement, rather than detached accuracy, the question of why you should care can't be postponed. Or rather, if Brian is right about what there is and about how we can know it, then the question of why we should care isn't an optional add-on. It's built into the picture from the start. So when objects and meanings and systems exist only at the middle distance through ongoing interaction and stabilization, then they depend on our continued engagement to remain what they are. Caring isn't a psychological attitude layered on top of a neutral world. It's part of what keeps the world in view. And that's why a theme of Brian's work is that we shouldn't treat values, ethics, or significance as separate domains. Once we acknowledge flex and slop, we can also acknowledge responsibility for how we draw boundaries, for how we maintain categories, and for how our systems, again, conceptual or computational, act in the world. And I think in the more recent book, The Promise of AI, Brian captures that point really nicely through the distinction between reckoning and judgment. Reckoning, the manipulation of formal structures according to explicit rules, is precisely what machines excel at. But judgment, the ability to determine what counts as relevant or appropriate or meaningful in a situation, remains situated and human, perhaps irreducibly so. The danger, I take it, that Brian thought was not that machines would become too powerful, but that either we'd mistake reckoning for judgment, and in doing so attempt to offload responsibility rather than confront it, or that if we were unduly impressed by the reckoning prowess of machines, we would ourselves become more machine-like. So when Brian asks, why should you care? The answer is not something like, because philosophy is important, although it is, or because the stakes are high, although they are. It's because once we're engaged in a world that can push back on us, disengagement isn't a neutral option. To do philosophy, in Brian's sense, to remain at the middle distance, is already to accept a kind of ethical posture, one that treats thought and practice and world as mutually answerable. So, taken together, this way of approaching metaphysics, epistemology, and ethics is not just a set of views within philosophy, it's a view about what philosophy itself is for. Brian's work consistently resisted the idea that philosophy should aim at final theories, sharp boundaries, and complete formalization, but instead treated philosophy as an ongoing effort to stay oriented, to keep our thinking in touch with the world, with our practices, and what's at stake in them. In that sense, flex, slop, and the middle distance are metaphilosophical commitments. They're kind of entangled constraints on how philosophy can be done without losing what it's meant to be about. So that brings me back to that moment in 2004, carrying boxes of books from the U-Haul truck. What strikes me now is not just the content of the remark, although I have plagiarized it myself on several occasions, but rather the setting. Right. As I said, Brian wasn't giving a keynote address or revising a journal article. We were in the middle of a practical activity at just the right distance from the world for philosophy to matter. And in retrospect, that seems exactly right. Brian's work, through ideas like flex and slop and the middle distance, isn't about isolating metaphysics from epistemology or either of them from questions of value. It was about refusing to let philosophy drift too far from the conditions under which thinking and knowing and caring actually take place. So those ideas aren't answers to the three questions of philosophy. They're constraints on how those questions can be asked without losing touch with the world. That, at least, is how Brian taught me to do philosophy and how to write what was apparently a passable PhD thesis, not by tidying it up too quickly, but by staying with it at the middle distance, for it to remain answerable to what there is, how we know, and why we should care. Thanks.
Thank you so much, Joel. Our final speaker is Güven, Güzeldere, and Güven will be, well, I should say Güven's an AI and consciousness researcher and received his PhD at Stanford and has taught courses in philosophy, psychology, and cognitive science at Duke University and at Harvard University. Güven, I'll pass to you.
Okay, thank you very much. I suppose you see my screen now, right? I'll just do a brief PowerPoint. Okay. So first of all, thank you for the invitation. I think this is a great event. I know that Brian did value the thoughts of everyone involved, who were in the morning session, or Joe and Joel, and, in the session after us. And I think he would be happy to hear us talking about his thoughts this way. I also want to say sorry. I think in Joe's presentation, there was some echo that was coming from my computer until I figured it out when somebody warned me and I muted my microphone, and I think that solved it. So sorry about that, Joe. So I want to convey a few anecdotal things about Brian the man, and also talk about a little bit of his philosophical thinking. So I arrived at Stanford University in 1989 as a graduate student to do a PhD in their newly minted symbolic systems and philosophy program. Now, 1989 does sound like the Stone Age, and maybe it was, but that's how it happened. And in my first year, so one of the first courses I took as a graduate student was Terry Winograd's class, where he was teaching a mix of AI and phenomenology and so forth. He might remember that. And I also saw a course that was offered by somebody named Brian Smith, whom I had not heard of before. Now, as some of you know for sure, sorry, let me turn on the clock so that I don't run over my time. One of the advantages of a place like Stanford University is its geographical location. It's in the middle of the Silicon Valley, and it's surrounded by research institutes like SRI, like Xerox PARC, and so forth that housed a number of very interesting and very smart people who once in a while got adjunct appointments in nearby schools and taught a class. And Brian was an adjunct professor in philosophy, and he was teaching a course on philosophy of computing or philosophy of computation or philosophical foundations of computation, something like that. I was actually thinking about taking some other class, but I noticed that Brian was involved in Computer Professionals for Social Responsibility. And I thought, oh, here's a technical person who is interested in things that are broader than just these technical issues. As you know, and I think Terry Winograd talked about this in his talk, computer professionals for social responsibility worried about things that had to do with computers that we don't longer really worry about. I mean, today we worry about, whether AI will take our jobs or, enslave us humans and so forth. But they were worried about then President Reagan's idea of the building an invulnerable shield so that the Soviet missiles, nuclear weapons, and so forth would never reach America. And Brian thought that was not quite right. So he was one of the founders with Lucy Suchman and Terry Winograd of Computer Professionals for Social Responsibility, and then went on to become its first president and so forth. So anyway, that's how I met Brian. Now, another thing that I found interesting after I met him in his class, which was a great class, by the way, because I had never taken a class that really questioned the metaphysical foundations of computation, was that somebody in the morning session mentioned how he was a very humble man. I think it was Atusa. And he was a humble man, and he was a great teacher too. So he typed up his answers to our various, when he gave us an exam or something, and he didn't just scribble his comments on the side of the paper. He typed them up, and I noticed that when he printed them, there was a timestamp. I think that came from the printer, and it said something like 3:35 in the morning or something. I thought, as a young person at the time, that, okay, so all right, hours like 3:30 and so forth belong to graduate students, but not to adults. When you become an adult and a professor, you don't, you go to bed at, 11 and get up at 6 in the morning and so forth. That wasn't quite the case. Now, anyway, so that's the anecdotes. Brian at the time, so this is how he looked more recently but at the time he looked sort of like that, and you probably recognize the man on the right, who is now having a lot of time about the Epstein files and so forth. And they're probably talking after some computer scientists getting together around the at the time, arguing about various things and so forth. So let me move on. And this is from my graduation. So it's me in the middle, long time ago, and it's Brian on my right. There's Fred Jeske on my left. Another person who was in my committee was John Perry, but he was out of town that weekend, so he couldn't come. So that's how Brian looked at the time. And among the philosophers, Brian cared most about John Hogland's work, who coined the term good old-fashioned AI, GoFi. There was actually a Festschrift for Hogland when Hogland was alive, back in 2010, I think it is. So I took this picture. This was this was framed and hanging in Brian's office. Haugland had a heart attack or something like that during the Festschrift, and so the Festschrift had to be cut short and so forth. There's an unfortunate event, but Brian valued friendship with John Haugland, and he talked a lot about it later on, which I'll come to in just a second. Reckoning and Judgment, The Promise of Artificial Intelligence. Both Joe and Joel mentioned this book. This was the book that came out right before new AI was announced to the world. So this is written as a critique of the classical paradigm AI. However, I think what it says applies very much to new AI too. By reckoning, so Brian took the word reckoning from Thomas Hobbes, where in the Leviathan, Hobbes talks about, how a mechanical conception of calculating or rationation happens. But that doesn't, in Brian's mind, that doesn't amount to judgment. So judgment is something that humans do, and reckoning is something that maybe computers do, but a lot of reckoning doesn't amount to judgment. So whether or not that's the case, I read this essay just a couple of weeks ago in the New York Times. It's an opinion piece that says humans possess one thing that AI does not, judgment. Now, this person who wrote the essay, I don't think knows about Brian's work. He doesn't mention it, but I think he should have. And in fact, when he says that there's a tendency in higher education and AI accelerates the pressure, that if a machine can do the general work, humans should retreat to the specific. He believes the opposite, human judgment, he thinks is important and so forth. So I'm just mentioning this as an example of how maybe Brian foresaw what was coming in, even though, as I said, he wrote this book before the new AI was the talk of the town. And somewhere he says, the real problem above and beyond ChatGPT saying false things or hallucinations is that ChatGPT has no idea or understanding about what it says. Now, if you ask me, so where does he say that? I'm not sure. I looked for it for several days. I couldn't find it. It's probably in one of his talks, and I wrote it down, but I'm not making it up. This was, in fact, Brian saying, what he was thinking about ChatGPT. What Brian thought about the new AI was, I think, a lot of it, at least, was in opposition to what Jeff Hinton thinks about new AI and so forth. And Brian did talk about this quite a bit. He was concerned about people thinking that the new AI platforms are intelligent and they do thinking and so forth. And I think that his main disagreement was whether machines have a different way of cognizing things than we do. I think that was Jeff Hinton's view, and Brian didn't agree with that. Now, how do I know all this? I know it because, I've turned into something like a radio and podcast personality, and I was doing a radio broadcast. And when Brian's book came out, The Promise of AI, I thought maybe I should do an episode with him talking about this book. And while we were talking about the book, it looked like Brian was actually, he came up with great examples that were not in the book. He was quite loose in the way he said things and so forth, in a way that I don't think happened a lot in his writings. So I thought, okay, then maybe we can, and after he got the cancer diagnosis, it's clear that, we all have limited time on Earth. But we just don't know, when the limited time is going to come to an end, and we live like, we'll never die. The big difference in Brian's case was that he was given, 3 to 6 months to live when he first was diagnosed. He did live for more than 3 years after that, because I think he has a strong constitution and so forth, and he did everything systematically, correctly, and the right way, and so forth, in terms of following doctor's orders and so on. However, it's a limited amount of time. So what can you do? I knew that, Brian had a lot to say about a lot of things, about AI, computer science, philosophy, metaphysics, and so forth. And I thought maybe he can just say them if he doesn't have the time to write them up, write all of them up. So we started the podcast series, a weekly podcast series, and did go through a lot of things, including some biographical material and some philosophical material and so forth. I think the two most important topics in Brian's mind can be summarized as meaning and mechanism. Mechanism, Brian means something like a causal account of effective computability. What computers can do by, pushing and pulling things nearby through, that can be causally explained and so forth. But he thought meaning could not be explained fully in that way. And by meaning, he meant the problem of intentionality. It's a deeper problem. And these views that treated meaning as an issue that can be explained like mechanism can be, he thought were kind of superficial. So, we named the podcast series Conversations on Meaning and Mechanism, and we talked about it roughly every week, except when there were some health-related emergencies and so forth. So one thing I should mention, though, is besides being a humble person and a great teacher and so forth, and I take it that he was a very good administrator, although I was never a member of an institution where he was an administrator. He also never, ever complained about physical difficulty. Now, being a patient where you have to have blood transfusions every so often and have to go through rounds of chemotherapy and so forth, it's not easy for sure. And it's a very Brian kind of thing not to complain about that at all. And he didn't. So here I should mention one other anecdote. When I was at Stanford, at the end of my first year, I invited Daniel Dennett as a speaker. Dennett was just coming up with his book, Consciousness Explained. He was actually correcting the galley proofs and so forth while he was in various places, including Stanford. And he was on his way to a sailing trip in Alaska. So he came for 2 days. The first day he gave the talk, and then we took him to dinner or something. And then, as audacious as I guess I was when I was a younger person, I invited Dan for dinner. I said, I'll cook a dinner for you. So, the second night, you don't have to be yourself. We can have dinner and talk about various things. So that was my idea. And it was audacious because I was, living in a graduate student housing with almost no kitchen at all, and, sharing the space with somebody else and so forth. That morning, the morning where I was about to go for, food shopping, I got a phone call. It was Brian, and he said, "Well, I hear you are inviting Dan for dinner. Is that correct?" I said, "Yeah, that's right." And he said, "Well, we just finished this house on the hill of, Santa Cruz Mountains." And he said, "It's kind of nice. maybe you can bring Dan over here and we can have dinner all together. Now, this is a very typical Brian thing to say about the house. It's kind of nice. It wasn't just kind of nice. I mean, it was a gorgeous house, made with cedar and fir wood, and I think it was part of it was designed by Brian's older brother Julian, and so forth. It was the most impressive house that I had ever seen in my entire life at the time. But that's how Brian was, and we had dinner in his house, and that's how I got to see his house for the first time. I must also say, in his West Coast days, so. Sorry about that. So you probably know that Brian did his PhD on the East Coast at MIT, and then he moved to West Coast to Xerox Palo Alto Research Center. In his West Coast days, he was a bit of a larger than life character, I thought. He had this great house that I just talked about. He also had a red sports car, and it was the kind of car that you wouldn't just go to a car dealership and pick it. It was probably ordered from a special catalog or something. I forget what it was. It was maybe a Lamborghini, or it was something like that. It was a very special thing. I think, however, after having moved to first Indiana and then to Duke and then to Toronto, Brian became more of a, I don't know, regular sized person, let me say, not a larger than life sized person any longer. That probably had to do with being Canadian and Toronto in Canada and so forth. Anyway, this is just a side. Let me see what I have. Okay, so in his final days, Brian worked on a book that he had written mostly, but it wasn't quite finished. So we wanted him to finish it. It's the book that Jill Einstein mentioned, and it's coming out of MIT Press, I think, sometime this year. It's called Computational Reflections. It's a great book, I think. I read several versions of it. And this is Brian taking a look now at the book. Anyone who has done any work of this kind with Brian would know that he's very particular about formatting and typesetting. So you can see that Brian's books and papers are his design, unmistakably so. And this book is also like that. However, it was not easy for Brian to do the typesetting all by himself. So one of his former students, Jim Brink, did the typesetting for him. He actually went to Toronto a couple of times and so forth. So I would like to give a shout out to Jim for doing that. And in the end, the book was pretty much according to Brian's specifications, which is a feat, I think. Now, if you are concerned or interested in Brian's works, the opus of everything he has written, books, papers, talks he has given, and so forth, they can be found in the ageofsignificance.org website. This is a website that Brian had registered a long time ago, and it's now Jim mostly is putting everything in there to make sure that Brian's legacy lives on. I think that's important. So I think I'm going to stop here and leave you with a photograph from the time we were doing the podcasting. So this is and that's how I would like to remember Brian, smiling and happy, and he was happy in his final years in Toronto, and we talked about various things, and I can maybe mention some of them in our question answer session, but for now I think I'll stop. Okay, thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Güven. As was mentioned, we'll go on to a Q&A now. I'd like to invite anyone with a question to raise their hands. I'd also like to invite the panelists, if you have questions for each other or points that you'd like to kind of riff off of or comment on from each other's talks, please let me know as well. People a second. And maybe I can start with one then.
Okay.
My question for all of you is maybe just an opportunity to reflect on Brian's last book on Reckoning and Judgment, which you all talked about briefly. And just to maybe comment on how his work, which was, as was mentioned, primarily about sort of like GoFi processing, how it still applies to current LLMs. So for example, are there key arguments there that you're surprised still really work with this new development in AI? Are there things that you think maybe don't work? When we look at questions like computers not being sort of subject to norms that humans are, or questions about sort of understanding and whether or not large language models, which are operating primarily on text only, whether they can achieve genuine meaning. Like, does it surprise you that some of these arguments maybe still work? Is there anyone on the panel? Oh, yeah, go ahead, Joseph.
I'll
Great.
speak to that.
I'll speak after you.
Of course, the promise of artificial intelligence did discuss the machine learning structures that are behind the large language models. And I think that, in fact, his dual discussion of those, that is, both his recognition of the significant accomplishment of machine learning, which for Brian was about demonstrating the points he wanted to make about how there is much more to the world, the kind of flex and slop that Joel was also pulling out, than is evident in our available calculations. And I think that on the other side, that this was still lacking understanding and judgment, as Güven quoted Brian and to that effect. So although ChatGPT and other large language models come after that book, I think the conceptualization underlying them was already included in Brian's arguments and in the new book, Computational Reflections, which is not so much about AI as about theoretical computer science. But similar themes are connected. I don't see that. I don't see the large language models as outrunning Brian's critique. I see them as fulfilling what he was saying, that machine learning systems would in fact become more and more powerful, which in fact they have, without overcoming those limitations, and that something quite different would be required to achieve anything like the reckoning that he thinks the judgment that he thinks is essential to intelligence and human ways of life.
Great, thank you, Joseph. Güven?
Okay, so I pretty much agree with everything that Joe says. I'll just mention a few things in addition. So, for example, one of the things that worried me when I first read the book, The Promise of AI, I wondered if he was giving a Hubert Dreyfus kind of critique of what computers can't do. And I asked him that, and he said, no, I mean, in the philosophy of computation class, I remember he often talked about how people who, wanted to say that computers were different from humans knew a lot about humans, but they really didn't know anything about computers. And, and he cited Hubert Dreyfus as one person, philosopher Charles Taylor as another such person, and so forth. And he kind of came to that point. So that's one thing. I also want to mention something that Terry Winograd mentioned in the morning session. He talked about Joseph Weizenbaum's effect on Brian. Joseph Weizenbaum wrote a book called Computer Power and Human Reason. It was, one of the first books on AI that I read in graduate school and so forth. I was never quite sure if Joseph Weizenbaum really meant that book as a critique of AI or whether he was trying to say good things about AI. And when I asked about this to Brian, he said, yeah, I'm not sure. It looked like at the time at MIT when Joseph Weizenbaum was a professor there, he kind of meant it, and he meant Eliza too, so forth, to show how, what AI can do and how computers can be very powerful and so forth. However, after Weizenbaum retired and went back to his native Germany and so forth, I've seen him say things like, "Oh no, he just meant what he wrote in the book," and as a critique of AI, and Eliza was sort of a ironic demonstration of there's a problem with us human beings in attributing things that we shouldn't to computers, and Eliza was a demonstration of that. Sorry, I keep getting phone calls, but I turn off my phone. Okay. One other thing I want to say, in addition, maybe this is a good time to say it, Brian was a truly interdisciplinary person. He came to Duke University as a job candidate to be the director of a interdisciplinary center, a humanities center. And in that visit, he not only gave a talk about I think it was about cognitive science and interdisciplinary approaches and so forth. He also gave a different talk in the philosophy department. He gave a different talk in the computer science, and he gave a different talk in religious studies. And he was able to do all of them very well. That's very impressive. I don't think many of us can pull that off. And Brian had, of course, long held fundamental presuppositions about modesty, deference to the physical world, mattering and so forth, and giving a damn, as somebody said. But he was also a truly interdisciplinary thinker. And one of the papers that he gave at that visit to the religious studies faculty was a paper called God Approximately. Now, approximately should remind you of course, an engineering approach, right? But he meant God to be in there because, somebody said, I think maybe it was Terry in the morning, that Brian was a philosopher at heart. He was, but he was actually not just any philosopher at heart. He was a metaphysician at heart. He really liked metaphysics, and by metaphysics, he meant things like intentionality or things like God and so forth. And he didn't mind talking about those things. There are a few versions of the paper, God Approximately, you can find in the Age of Significance website. If you're interested, you can go take a look. And now I'll stop. Okay, thank you.
Thank you.
I might jump in if that's okay. So one of the interests, so I teach a philosophy of AI class here in Cork, and I used to teach it in Toronto. I think it's the same one that Brian ended up teaching as well. But for most of the time that I taught it, I taught philosophy of AI as a branch of cognitive science. So it was interested in the same kinds of questions that philosophers of mind are interested in about the nature of the mind and its operations and perception and so on. And, over the last 5 or 6 years, that way of approaching philosophy of AI has sort of become out of date. Now, the people who describe themselves as philosophers of AI are mostly working in ethics, right? So I think what's kind of unique or prescient and significant about Brian's work is that he always had a foot in both camps. And so even though that So I show my students the famous distracted boyfriend meme, where I have philosophy of AI. It used to be looking at philosophy of mind, but now it's looking at ethics. But I think, testament to Brian's interdisciplinarity is the fact that he's able to focus on both. So even though the book in 2019 was slightly before we suddenly got ChatGPT and all of the other large language models, the stuff that's in there about the difference between reckoning and judgment and the potential worries that one might have about mistaking reckoning for judgment or becoming more like reckoning machines ourselves, is sort of uniquely buttressed in Brian's case by the fact that he knows about the underlying architectures and the technical side of things as well. So I think even though the book was published a little bit before we all started worrying about these things, I think everything he says in it that's relevant to AI ethics is still relevant to AI ethics as well.
Thank you all for answering that. That's really nice. Are there other, oh, you do have a question online, sure. And I see some hands in the audience too. But why don't we jump to online? Thank you, Zoe.
So we have a question online. What would you say of the implications of Brian's or your work on philosophy of math, i.e. dynamics math as Brian understood it?
I take it that's to anyone on the panel that'd like to comment.
Does anyone want to go first, or do you want me to say something?
Go ahead.
Well, I mean, I don't have a lot to say because I don't really know a lot about Brian's philosophy of math. I remember, in his interest in philosophy of representation, we did talk about representing mathematical objects and, whether there's any causal effect there or not. But, that was a long time ago. So, however, I want to take this opportunity to mention something else. So a number of people in the morning session, I think, talked about computation in the wild. Ed Hutchins had a book from UCSD, Cognition in the Wild, I think it was called, and maybe I think Joe mentioned this too. What do you mean by computation in the wild? I asked this to Brian. I said, well, you're committed to embodiment and, things being embedded and so forth. And so am I. Let me just say, I also don't, I for many years, I tried to defend AI as having, in principle, the potential to be like human beings. But I don't think that this AI now, without embodiment, that's working only on texts that it scans, is that AI. So that aside, there's Stephen Wolfram is a computer scientist who writes about AI and various things and so forth. And he talks about computation in the wild. And he says, well, a lot of things can be understood as computation in the wild. For example, how a brook, flows over various stones and so forth in its path. I asked this about Brian. He thinks, no, that's kind of a empty way to talk about computation. And Wolfram, in fact, means something like laws of nature, physical laws, as doing things according to a way that can be described as computation. But that's not what Brian meant, as far as I understand. So as far as I understand, computation was something more specific for Brian. And Melanie Mitchell asked what can AI accomplish without a body and so forth. These are, I think, very good and very timely questions. And I wish Brian was around so that, this is a time that we need his wisdom to answer such questions. And sorry, I didn't really answer the philosophy of math question, but maybe Joe or Joel know more about it.
I can't say that I do know what Brian's philosophy of math happened to be, but So when I first met Brian, when he arrived at the University of Toronto, I went to him. I was introduced to him by Ronnie D'Souza in the philosophy department, and I went to Brian full of enthusiasm because I was really interested in the time in the kind of stuff he'd been doing in Indiana on the dynamical approach to cognitive science. So the stuff with Bob Port and Tim van Gelder and all of that stuff. And I said, oh, this is a radical new way of thinking about cognition and AI. And I really want to write a PhD dissertation on this because the claim that the mind is a dynamical system is revolutionary. I was super enthusiastic about it. And of course, Brian being resistant to neat edges and things being too easy to formalize in that way, said, of course, it is strictly trivially true that mind is a dynamical system in the sense that it changes over time, like everything else in the universe. So, I mean, you could write a dissertation in which you defend a claim that's trivially true, but
oh, really?
Yeah, but it might be more interesting to think about, various other things, the kinds of things he said, like, not the claim that the mind is a dynamical system, but whether this representational framework or this mode of theorizing is preferable and what its advantages are and so on and so forth. So, I'm afraid I don't know much about what he would have said about philosophy of maths or the dynamic maths that was mentioned in the question that was asked. But he certainly knew that it applied to stuff in the world, but whether that's the interesting thing to say about the systems to which it applies, I think he pointed me in a different direction in that case.
Yeah, I mean, I think that
Joel, now you need to answer the question.
Well, I think that Joel's talk provided a lovely basis for seeing where Brian would want to go with that. Because, of course, part of what Joel, you were emphasizing was the emphasis on engagement and dynamics. And so the thing that I would draw from that, and this is a projection, I never talked to Brian about philosophy of mathematics in particular, which is not an area I know a lot about. But I think Brian would have been committed to seeing mathematical practice and where it's going and where it sees future problems, not just the determination of certain kinds of achieved background, but the dynamics of ongoing thinking, setting new issues, new problems, revising and thinking. It would be the things that he would have wanted to emphasize in thinking about mathematics as a research practice rather than just an accumulating body of achievements.
Mm-hmm. We did have two audience questions, one here, yes.
I actually want to.
Is there a mic in the room? Because I can't hear.
Can you hear me?
Can you hear me? Can now, yeah.
Now I can.
Okay, good. I want to briefly come back to the computation in the wild question, because I spent some time with Brian about a year ago going over his sort of intellectual biography, if you will, because I had been asked to write the preface to the new book. And I think computation in the wild was a crucial phase in Brian's intellectual trajectory. He meant as a practitioner, right? By computation in the wild, he meant what people do, what computer professionals do. Mm-hmm. And he was employed as a programmer on a big physics project that took him between Toronto and Berkeley way back now. We're talking early 70s. And when he left that to go to MIT to try to find some people that he could study with about what was important about what he'd been doing, and he was already looking for this issue of the significance of what he was doing, as well as the mechanics of it, if you will. He found a program in the sociology of science, I think, something like that. I need to check my notes. And very quickly was extremely disillusioned by it because these people knew nothing about what his experience was like, right? They had theories about computing and about being a computer professional, but they had no experience of it. And he had nothing to learn from them, and they didn't want to hear from him. And I think when I have always understood his references to computing in the wild after that to mean the computational practice of the people who engage with computers on a daily basis as part of their business, their employment, their activity, whether it's employment or not. And that may or may not resonate with the panel, but I'd be interested in your comments. I've got the mic, and I'll say one more thing that I couldn't get in this morning. With respect, and because I actually had a great deal of pleasure and an impression, and I was very impressed by a lot of what Hamid said this morning, but I want to disagree with one thing. Brian was a profoundly religious person. He just had nothing to do with the organized churches. And what he used to say was, I don't think the churches are doing what we need anymore, but we cannot do without what they have done historically, which is hold us to account. Thank you.
Thank you. Sounded like a suggestion of a kind of anthropological, very Hutchin-esque interpretation of computation in the wild. The panel want to add to that? Any comments?
I mean, the one thing I would say is that the emphasis on practical programming and in the variety of uses and developments of computational devices and practices was really centrally important for Brian. It comes out in the new book, Computational Reflections, in which the things, many of the things that he thinks are being left out, the norms concerning and the directedness to the target in the world that a computational system is ultimately going to be taken about, is in fact has to be filled in by programmers who have to keep their eyes both on how the system works internally and how it answers to the tasks that that a computer system is used for. That plays a very central role in the new book, and of course, it also extends to the many and various ways in which computational systems get deployed for tasks that were previously not seen as possibilities. So it's the constant open-endedness of computational practice that he wanted to emphasize, as well as its engagement with other activities and its accountability to them.
Thank you, Joel. Or
Joel, do you want to say something? I have something to add.
Go ahead.
Okay, so yeah, I mean, I agree. I don't see the people in the room, but I from the voice I recognize that was Henry. Hi, Henry. I agree that Brian. So computation in the wild meant something for Brian and something important, because in the wild means probably embodied, probably trafficking in the physical world with a commitment and so forth. These are all issues that are important to Brian's mind. However, he just didn't like the way that Stephen Wolfram talked about computation in the wild as it's sort of a replacement for physical laws or laws of nature. That's all I'm going to say. I also did make a note of Hamid's mentioning in the morning whether Brian was a religious person or not. Here, I agree with Henry that Brian, I think, was a deeply religious person, although he didn't, follow any organized religions. Of course, there's a difference between that in fact, Brian talked about how metaphysics was the thing that he really cared about. By that, I mean meaning, intentionality, and so forth, in the meaning and mechanism kind of distinction. And he said, well, it was kind of a coincidence that as he was coming of age, computers were, being touted as the new technological advancement, and that was true, but and there weren't too many people who knew about computers, and Brian always, being good with mechanical things, and he's always good in figuring out how things work and so forth, was very good in computer programming, and he was employed in a number of projects and so forth. So in that regard, Brian thought about computing or computation as kind of a path to metaphysics. He thought that was a good way to talk about intentionality and meaning, and not necessarily, he didn't really care about computation in and of itself. So I also just wanted to mention this. Okay, that's all.
Thank you. Joel, anything to add, or I'll take another question from audience?
Yeah, go ahead.
Yes, yeah, there's a question over here.
So I really appreciate Henry guiding the discussion in this direction, because my question overlaps quite a bit with his, and I think it continues on in some of the things that Joe and Güven were just saying. So it's kind of a softball now, I guess. I don't think it's an accident that at the end of Brian's life, he was writing about computational reflection, or his work on the lambda calculus, or 3-Lisp. I do think there are direct links between those things and his metaphysics. I think they're kind of complicated to see if you don't have a background in both, which most people don't. Brian was very unique, but I'd like to encourage the panel, if possible, to try to connect the dots between computational reflection in programming languages, and Brian's metaphysics. And I think Joe and Güven had just started that picture in their remarks to Henry's question, but I'd like you to continue doing that, because this was something, I have a background in computer science, but not metaphysics, but it wasn't until having read his recent book, the Computational Reflections book, that it kind of hit me. I saw that, I mean, this is probably overstating it, but oh my gosh, I always thought Brian was just this interdisciplinary guy who worked on these disparate fields and was amazing in all of them, to, oh my gosh, Brian's been working on the same project his entire life, and I never met anyone like that who could do that. And so for me, his book, which I would encourage everyone to read in a month when it comes out, was the thing that revealed that to me. And I know that a couple of you, I don't know if all of you have, but I know that some of you have read his book, his forthcoming book. But even if not, I'd like to encourage you to sort of try to connect the dots from the computer science side, which I'm familiar with, to more of the metaphysical side. Thank you.
Thank you. Joel or Joseph, would you like to jump in, since Güven ended the last answer?
Well, I guess, yeah, I mean, so I certainly always got the sense that that Brian used to joke that the 7-volume work that is cited in On the Origin of Objects, having the title The Middle Distance, was soon to be forthcoming, right? And so I think there certainly is, as the person who asked the question, I don't see who they are. As I mentioned, there is certainly a sense in which there's a single project running throughout, from what he did in his PhD dissertation all the way up to the most recent stuff. And so connecting the dots between the technical work on self-reflection in programming languages about which I don't know, and some of the underlying metaphysics and philosophy of mind questions about intentionality hopefully the new book, which I haven't seen, will help to do that. Come back to me. I've lost my train of thought. 1 second. Yeah.
No worries. We have 5 minutes remaining, but I think that'll be hopefully enough time for all the panelists to have a response. But Joseph, would you like to jump in?
Yeah, I mean, I was somebody for whom, who I have read Computational Reflections, and that I knew Brian, of course, had done so much of work in theoretical computer science, but our conversations had always been about the philosophical side of things. And so this was new to me, but what was striking was how much continuity there was in that early project, or as Joel, you were saying, that he was already thinking about these things at the technical level. That is, I mean, in one sense, of course, this goes back to, in philosophy, a long series of thinking about how intentional directedness towards anything always requires self-directedness, or what would usually have been called self-consciousness before consciousness as a word was taken over. And so how accountability to the larger normative concerns that you were emphasizing in your talk, Joel, and situating oneself in the world as essential to the very possibility of intentional directedness, and which Brian characteristically thought couldn't just be done at a superficial level, but needed to be worked out in detail in how a computational language could incorporate and deal with a distinction between internal states and other things that those states were about, and how to keep that straight in ongoing dynamics of the operation was central to the metaphysics and has been part of his technical work all along. I was delighted to learn.
Joel,
I remembered what I was going to say, right? So, I mean, I think the interesting thing, or the distinctive thing about Brian's work, is that if there are, I see his kind of project as analogous to some other projects in metaphysics that are currently ongoing. I'm thinking here of a kind of a parallel but distinct difference between Brian's approach to metaphysics and the kind of naturalized metaphysics you see in people like James Ladyman and Don Ross in their book Everything Must Go and that sort of thing. And I think what's particularly useful and perhaps more helpful from Brian's perspective, to take from Brian's work, is using computer science and programming languages and those kinds of things as a way of articulating a metaphysics is more helpful, because some of the concepts that we're interested in as metaphysicians, to do with intentionality or causation and so on, are also right there in the subject matter of computer science or programming. So unlike trying to underwrite a naturalized metaphysics using physics, doing it using computer science as the substrate for articulating that version is potentially richer, because there's a much more natural overlap in terms of some of the things we're interested in.
I think we're just out of time now, so I apologize to Güven if you had something also to add. But just for the sake of keeping on schedule, we'll be moving to a coffee break next. And then please join me in thanking the panelists for sharing their reflections.
Thank you.
Thanks for the